through these questions. I'm sorry you have 2 pages. Maybe that's why people didn't come. It's because they didn't do their homework and they were afraid I was going to grade them. So let's look at the first one, verses 1 through 24. Chapter 9. The main point of the chapter is God dealing with Israel, the nation of Israel. Number 2, what is causing Paul to be so sorrowful? What is it? Unbelief with his people in what? They didn't, okay, so they didn't recognize the Messiah for who he was. And so there was grief for the national. Now remember, guys, there are individuals. Oh, hi, Linda. Carrie's not here today, huh? Oh, bless her heart. Okay. Hi. Very nice to see you. Thank you for bringing our Linda to us. I'll get that for you if you want me to, so that you'll have it when you leave today. And then there's chapter 10. Right there. So you'll need to pick up chapter 10. And she likes to sit right here. Okay. All right. Awesome. Well, thank you for bringing her. No. We're so great. We're so glad you're here.
Okay. I'm going to try one more time, and then if I can't get it, she can get it.
Thank you very much for doing that. Excellent. Excellent. All right.
Nice to meet you.
You too. All right. I think so.
Okay, then I'll see you later.
All right. Thank you. All right. So number 3, Paul will list some of the unique privileges that belong to Israel. What are they? What are some of the things that belong only to Israel? The adoption as children of God. Okay. What else? The law. What else? The glory. And what does the glory encompass? The Shekinah glory, the actual visible, physical manifestation of God on earth. Only Israel ever got to see that. So that was something unique to them. The prophets, the prophecies. What else? The priesthood, the servants, the service to God. All of that belonging strictly to the nation of Israel. Number 4, for they are not all Israel who are of Israel. Boy, that particular statement has caused a lot of issues. They are not all Israel who are of Israel. What does that mean?
Even though they were born as an Israelite, it doesn't necessarily mean that the blessings from God come to everyone if they don't believe.
Okay, so there were remember the circle that I drew? The nation of Israel. And to that nation of Israel, there were covenant promises. Remember what the covenant promises were? The land, the kingship of David. There would always be someone on the throne. The nation of Israel had promises that God made to Abraham that were it didn't entail Abraham following the direction. It was simply God's promises to them. But out of that group of the nation of Israel, there's the Israel of God. And those are the faithful ones. Because we talked about the fact that we don't think about it, but just as there are people who call themselves Christians who really don't have a relationship with the Lord, there were Israelites who really didn't have a relationship with God. And just being born of Abraham wasn't enough to secure your salvation. Now, as we see that and we go, well, of course that's true. But I'm telling you, first century Jews, That's a shocking thing to say to them. Sorry, guys. That's a shocking thing to say, that just because you are an Israelite, you are not going to obtain your salvation, because they all believed that that was going to happen. So this nation and the covenant promises that God makes to them, and then the Israel of God is different. Now, where do we go wrong with that? We go wrong with that today because people have begun to believe that the Israel of God is the church. That's the replacement theology that we've talked about, which is this idea that the Israel of God is the church, not the believing remnant of Israel. And so if you believe that, then all the promises given to Israel belong to only the church. And as we get into chapter 11, we're going to see that we're grafted into those promises. They're not grafted in to our promises. All right, who are the children of the flesh and the children of the seed? Children of the flesh. Seed of Abraham, physical seed, right? Who would that be? No. Well, the physical seed would be the nation of Israel, but who else? Isaac, but also the physical seed. There's a lot. Abraham had other children. He had Ishmael, was his son with Hagar. And then later on, Abraham is going to have 6 more sons with a woman named Keturah after Sarah dies. And so he'll have those 6 sons who are leaders of Arab tribes. So there are physical descendants of Abraham that are not part of the sons of the seed. What are the children of the seed? What does that mean?
Through the line of Isaac and then through the line of Jacob.
Okay, so through the line of Isaac and through the line of Jacob and down through the 12 tribes. But how was that decided? I mean, Abraham had a son Ishmael, and then he had a son Isaac. How come Isaac is the seed son? Okay, so God chose the seed son. And what is the seed? What does that represent? Who comes from that seed? Okay, the Messiah. This is the lineage of the Messiah. If you go into Matthew or you go into Luke and you look at the genealogy, that's why that's important to know that. That's why it actually takes up a chapter that you need to read in there, is because that genealogy is quite important to know. It's through a lineage. God was very specific on who it was that he would choose. Yes. Okay. Yes.
Okay. So believing Jews that believe in Christ,
yes,
are not counted as the church of Christ.
No, believing Jews are also part of the church today. Because today, as Paul tells us, there's neither Jew nor Gentile, everyone is exactly the same. And so believing Jews actually are twofold blessed. They're blessed because they're of the nation of Israel and there are covenants made to them, but they're also part of the age of grace. And so they are part of the church the same way we are part of the church, through the same salvation experience. Grace through faith, no longer through the law, all of that kind of thing. So if you're a Jew today and you believe in the Messiah, actually you're doubly blessed.
And it does say too, what advantage is there to being a Jew?
Right. In this age of grace, we're all exactly the same, male or female. I mean, men had far more things available to them than the women did in those days, but he's saying in this age of grace, in the age of church, there's no difference between any of those. All right, so yes.
What's the percentage of believing Jews versus those who don't?
Okay, so on that circle picture that I gave you, I put that up at the top. It's a very small percentage. It's a remnant of Jews that are believing Jews. But I did put the figures up there for you. At the top? Yep. All right. So when God, this is number 6, when God chose one son over the other, was that all part of his plan? Okay. So as hard as that is for us to believe, yes, it was all part of his plan. This shows God's plan of. Do you know that I did not fill that in? Can you believe that? I didn't do my homework on that one. I evidently didn't do it. So, where the scripture says, whoever believes on him would not be put to shame. Is that the one? I am on number 6. This shows God's plan of, in verse 11. Okay. Or grace not, yeah, exactly. Election not works. Sorry, for some reason I didn't fill it in. Paul shows examples of God showing mercy to whom? Paul shows whomever he chooses, right? I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy. Number 8, Paul reminds them that Pharaoh was raised up by God. For what purpose? To show God's power. What else? What else does he say? There you go. That his name may be declared in all the earth. Do we still talk about the God and Pharaoh and the whole story of freedom for the Israelites out of Egypt? We do, even today, all these years later. So God certainly accomplished that. Number 9, what does it mean that, this is a tough one, what does it mean that God hardened his heart when he was speaking of Pharaoh? And why would that happen? So we spoke a little bit about that. The hardening of the heart.
Because Pharaoh was lost, and hearts are hardened when people are lost.
There you go. So God doesn't harden hearts so that you're lost. Your hearts are hardened because you are lost. And we walk in sin. And if you choose that lifestyle, God allows you. God allows you to continue on in that. He's not going to force anyone to make concessions. And so he raises Pharaoh up. And if you read the story of the Exodus, several times it says Pharaoh hardened his own heart. But then as we move along, it says, and God hardened the heart of Pharaoh. And so Pharaoh had already made his choice. He'd already made his decision. And God used that to accomplish his purposes. Because as Pharaoh hardened his heart, he made it more difficult for the children of Israel to leave Egypt. And so God was able to show his power, his might, his glory through that, even though Pharaoh's heart was hardened. Does that make sense? Okay. Number 10, the story of the potter and the clay shows us what?
God has power over the clay from the same lump to make one vessel for honor and one for dishonor.
Okay. So God has the power and the authority over that. Now, when Paul uses that example in Scripture, what is that in response to? Do you remember? There was a question that was asked. Do you remember? So the question is God unrighteous because he chooses one over the other? Is there unrighteousness in God? In fact, it's the title page of chapter 9. What shall we say then? Is there unrighteousness with God? Certainly not. And then he uses the example of the potter and the clay, because Paul doesn't ever really answer that question necessarily. What he's doing is he's making it very clear that, you know what? You don't even have to ask that question. Why does God make me this way? Why does God choose one? Why did God choose Israel? Why did God harden Israel and choose the Gentiles in the time? None of it makes sense to us. We want it all to be a level playing field. We want it all to be equal. We want everyone to have the same rights, everyone to be in, exactly the same. And God says, that's not my plan. And so when we go, but why? Paul is saying, you're clay. You don't get to ask why. You don't get to, because God has a plan and a purpose. And if you fight it, you're the one that's going to lose in that, because the plan will be accomplished. Okay?
Kathy, that reminds me of Job.
Job,
Where God says, who are you to
Exactly. And that's difficult for us because it's like, well, it affects me. If you made me into a flower pot and I wanted to be a teacup, it affects me. But God's saying, you know what? This is my business. And that's a concept that if we can somehow really wrap our brains around, that we are God's business. We're God's business. And so the things that happen to us for good and for not so good, that's God's work in our life. And he's doing it to accomplish his purposes. And the best thing we can do is submit to that, right? Not fight it. Because his plans are always to accomplish good in our life, even when we don't see it at the moment. It's being used to accomplish good. All right, now the second page was Paul is going to use the story of Hosea and his prostitute wife Gomer to show application of a similar situation that he's writing about in this chapter. The story of the book of Hosea actually references Israel's unfaithfulness to God and how he will separate from them because of it. But he will always have them return to him. Someday I'm going to teach the story of Hosea. It's such a fantastic book. I love it. And a lot of people don't know that story. And it's God's faithfulness to Israel, even though they are unfaithful. The prostitute represents Israel in this. They've committed adultery, and God, you know, there's divine judgment there, but the underlying love never changes, never stops for Israel. So number one says, while Hosea is speaking only of Jews, God is going to use it, Paul will use it to help explain God's plan to open salvation to the Gentiles, while promising disobedient Israel that they will return to him and be called children of God, sons of God. Number two, positionally, Israel is always the chosen nation. So my question is, what about today? Is Israel the chosen nation today? Okay, are they walking in the promises? Are they walking in the blessing? Those are conditional. If you remember, under the Mosaic law, God says, if you do this, I will bless you this way. But if you choose not to do this, then there will be judgment this way. And so he's very clear in those conditional promises with the nation of Israel that they have some actions that they need to perform. What about today? Are they walking under the blessing? Okay, not in that sense. But what about the unconditional promises of Israel? The ones made to Abraham, whereas the land is yours, the promises are yours, the descendants will be yours. I will always have a nation of you. You will always be the people, the chosen nation. Those are unconditional. Remember, God makes that with Abraham himself. He doesn't, it's not conditioned on whether Abraham behaves well or doesn't behave well. Yes.
Isn't that what they're fighting for now?
What do you mean?
With Hamas? And in my mind, I kind of see that, you know, like they have the righteousness of God to do what they're doing, but again, everything is skewed.
It is, and you know, everything that Israel does today is not sanctioned by God, but that doesn't mean, but the overlying picture is that doesn't mean that God has turned his back on the nation of Israel. And yet not everything they do is sanctioned by God. If they go out and do things that are incorrect, God isn't going to go, well, just because I love you, any more than we would our own children. If they go out and do things that they shouldn't do, you know, we're not going to be okay with that just because we love our children. And so there is discipline in that. And so we have seen in our lifetimes, just since 1948, since the nation of Israel has been established, we've seen both blessing on Israel and judgment on Israel, and God dealing with them. But dealing with the nation of Israel in a spiritual sense will not occur again in Israel until the tribulation period. And those of you who sat with me during Revelation, we saw that the revelation of Jesus Christ to John is God dealing with the nation of Israel again. The nation of Israel. Now, the world is included in that plan. They're part of that plan, but God is dealing with the nation of Israel, drawing Israel back to her. What do we see today? Today, God is drawing Jews into the land of Israel. In the 75 years that Israel has been a nation again, reborn as a nation, there are 8 million Jews that have come to Israel. If you stop and think about that, that is amazing. 8 million Jews. I feel like in the next decade or two, you're going to see that grow substantially. As more and more Jews leave areas of persecution, anti-Semitism ratcheting up, they're going to be coming back to Israel in unbelief, yes, but coming back to Israel. God is preparing the land. He's tilling the soil in anticipation for what's coming. And so the people need to be there so that he can deal with them when they're there. And the revival for the nation of Israel will happen during the tribulation period. Remember, we saw all of those through the seal judgments and the trumpet judgments and all the bowl judgments. We saw God dealing with the nation of Israel and the world as he begins to draw them back as a nation. And Paul's going to reference that as we move along into chapter 11 after our break. Yes.
It seems to me amazing, really, that countries like America are still supporting Israel. They're in favor of Israel.
Yes.
At least in word.
Yes.
But is that because of, surely couldn't be because we know we're supposed to. I mean, as a Christian, as a group of Christians, we know we should support Israel.
Yes.
God says he'll bless those who
yes.
This nation. But what is it that draws people that are not believers to still be in support of Israel?
Okay, so there's two reasons that we support Israel. One is a spiritual thing. And God has established America as one of the greatest supporters of Israel since her reestablishment. We are the primary ally of Israel. We have provided, Israel takes the largest amount of money that the United States of America has for defensive purposes. Every year she's been in existence, America provides money for Israel, large amounts of money, because we do that not for Christian principles necessarily, although God is using it in that way. We do it because they're a democracy. And they are the only democracy politically. See, the savvy position politically is they are a democracy over there, and one of the only ones in that Middle Eastern area. And so we want to support them to continue to have influence in that area that is not a democracy. So you've got Turkey, Iraq, Iran, Jordan, all of those areas around there, Egypt, all of those areas that fluctuate depending on the leaders. And so the political arena is we continue to support them because they are a democracy. But God has used that in the fact that we support them since the inception of this new nation. And so there's been a twofold thing there. And America has been blessed before that. Has been blessed because of it. I'm convinced of it. Two reasons America has been blessed is because we support Israel, and we have provided more missionaries in the world than all the nations of the earth combined. And so God has blessed America for those particular things. Keep in mind, God doesn't have a covenant with America. Okay, but we are a nation that's being used for his plans and purposes. And that's an exciting thing. However, as things begin to spiral, we may see that change. And towards the end, we know that Israel will have no friends. Israel will be on its own. Look at what's going to, I mean, we get a taste of it right now with this idea of a ceasefire and what we're demanding, and whether it's right or wrong, and the two-nation solution, and whether it's right or wrong, and all of that going on. This could be a real dividing point that we're going to see. But believe me, it's not just done out of the goodness of our heart. It's done for political purposes also that benefit everyone. Yes.
I was wondering how, like, God chose Israel,
Yes.
right? And then I said they're stubborn, they fall away.
Stiff-necked.
Yes, and I said, you know what? They are a picture of humanity.
Absolutely.
Okay, of the individual, of each one of us.
Absolutely.
Israel is a picture of each one of us. We love him, yet we disobey, we go back to him.
Absolutely.
You know, and I think God is showing, yes, we say he's showing his faithfulness to Israel,
Yes.
but it's his faithfulness to the individual.
Absolutely.
Each one of us.
Absolutely. That's why I said when I was 16 years old, when I came to the realization that if God had, because I was raised, where Israel was never discussed, and later found out it was replacement, and I said, if God can turn against his nation, Israel, then he can turn against me when I fail. And that's not the God that I know. And that led me on the journey of discovering for that very reason, because God's faithfulness to Israel is a picture to us. For the individual and for his church and for his people that he selected, that our disobedience is not enough to disconnect us from the love of God, because it's never dependent on that anyway, right? It's dependent on his grace. And so the picture of God that shows up with the nation of Israel is the same picture of God that we have in our relationship. And so it should be really, rather than the church trying to disconnect Israel from God in the fact that, the historical statements of, well, they killed Jesus and they rejected the Messiah and they did this and they did that. Rather than pulling them away, we should, as Paul is going to say, elevate them, because they're a picture of God's love. And that's a good thing for us. We want to see that. We want to see God loving his people, because that shows us. It's an example of how he loves us. Exactly what you said. Yep. All right, moving along. 3, however, the blessing for Israel can be removed or withheld due to disobedience. That is a conditional, the difference between a conditional covenant and a non-conditional. With continual disobedience, wrath, divine judgment, whatever you want to put in there, can fall on them. Why does God promise will always come to his people? What does God promise will always come to his people? I think I am over medicated today. Oh my goodness. All that singing last night. What does God promise will always come to his people?
Riches of his glory on whom he is full.
Okay, riches of his glory. The return, right? His love, all of those things. The scripture speaks often of a faithful remnant. This remnant theology is such an important concept for us to understand, because it carries us through the entirety of the Old Testament and the entirety of the New Testament. A small number of true believers. Do we see that apply in the Old Testament? Yes. And we have to remember that. We have to remember that all the people that were part of Israel were not part of the faithful of God. They didn't have a personal relationship with God. Just like there are people over in the nation of Israel right now that have no religious connection. There are Israelites, Jewish people in Israel and in the United States and in different countries that are atheists, secular. The difficult thing to remember is that Israel is a national, Jewishness is a nationality, but it's also a religion, and you can have the nationality without the religion. And so just because you're a Jew doesn't mean that you're a faithful Jew, any more than just because you're a white Caucasian means that you're a faithful Christian. It doesn't make any sense. See, that just doesn't make sense. And so how about the New Testament? Do we see a faithful remnant? How? How do we see a faithful remnant in the New Testament?
The apostles.
Okay, so we see at the beginning of the church, even when the day of Pentecost, when Peter preaches, 3,000 Jews. That's a remnant. That's a small number compared that were there in Jerusalem for the Passover. There would have been 1 million plus Jews come in to Jerusalem during the Passover. 3,000 were added to the church. It's a remnant, a believing remnant. Out of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, we read in the book of Acts, there was a believing remnant that come and believe in the Lord. But not the totality of it's never been the massive numbers. We should never we should never count whether something is successful with the Lord, whether there's large numbers or not, because that's not it. It's the faithfulness of the heart that God looks for. And so how does that apply to the nation of Israel today? We were talking about that earlier. In the Messianic Jewish people who have come to faith in the Messiah today. That's the faithful remnant that God has kept unto himself, that faithful remnant in the Jewish people today. And will it apply to them in the future?
Yes, all your children and all who are far off.
Yes. And so we're going to see that remnant theology as we move along in Romans. Paul is going to talk about all of Israel will be saved. And that's caused lots of arguments between lots of smart people who are biblical scholars of what that means. But if you have the remnant theology secure in your mind, you understand that that's the believing remnant. That is all of Israel. The ones who come to belief in the Messiah, that's the God of Israel. That's all of Israel that will be saved at that time, that come to know the Lord. Yes.
I have like a odd question, actually. So I have a good friend who's a believer and grown up a believer, and she just found out that she's like 40% Jewish.
Okay.
Does that make her a remnant if she was never raised knowing that she was part of? I mean, I know it's kind of an odd question, maybe irrelevant, but it just, like, do you have to be part of a national belief, or?
Maybe for your own self you do, but not in God's eyes. God already knows who is Jewish and who isn't long before we had DNA tests. And so he already knows what tribe you're from, your ancestry is from. He already knows, because we know that in Revelation, remember we talked about the fact that he's going to take 12,000 from each one of the 12 tribes. Well, if you don't know who your tribe is, which many Jews do not know because all those genealogy records were destroyed in 70 AD when the temple was burned by Rome. And so all those genealogy records were destroyed, but God knows where they belong. So in God's eyes, she is part of the faithful remnant, whether she knew it or not. Yeah.
It just made me think, like, oh.
Absolutely.
Do you even know? Like, God knows.
God absolutely knows, and he will know when he selects out of the 12,000, he'll know which tribe he's picking from. That's why when people talk about the lost tribes of Israel, I giggle, because they're not lost. You may not know where they're at, but God knows exactly who they are and where they're at, and he's going to work with them in the end time scenarios.
And that's how the people are, or why the people are returning.
Yes.
Because God is drawing them.
Absolutely. He promised that he would. The prophetic word was that I would draw them from the north and the south and the east and the west, all my sons and daughters. I'll draw them back into the land that I gave them, the good land that I gave them, he says. And he says, I'll draw them back in unbelief. They'll be like dry bones, you know. But then he promises that he's going to put flesh on those bones, and he's going to build them back up again. And we see that beginning to happen as all of these, and many times when Jews make aliyah back to the homeland, they have had no connection with Israel. Like they haven't ever lived there. Their parents didn't ever live there. Their grandparents didn't ever live there. But there is a longing in their heart to return to the land. This speck of land that, while it has some beautiful parts into it in the Galilee area and stuff that are gorgeous, for the most part is very deserty, dry, rocky, full of strife and violence and things going on everywhere. Oddities happening all over, and people are drawn and say, I am going to give up everything that I have in this land that I live in now, and I'm going to go home. Who could do that but God, to put that drawing point? But he brings them back to the land in preparation for what's going to happen. And remember, ladies, that's been basically in our lifetime, or not much more than our lifetime. That's how recent that's been, because for 2,000 years they were dispersed. They were not a nation. They didn't have a government. They didn't have a military. They were a vagabond people living in Poland and Russia and Ethiopia and Africa and different lands like that. And yet they kept the the language. They kept the culture. They kept the religion. They kept the knowledge of God. They kept all that kernel was within them. And has it gotten skewed? Absolutely. The rabbinical Judaism has certainly skewed that. But God has kept that kernel in them and drawn this massive number of people back to this dot of a land where he says, now I'm going to come and dwell among you. And there's going to come a time when Jesus Christ is going to come and sit on a throne, a literal throne, in a literal city of Jerusalem, at a literal temple, and rule and reign on earth, where the Jews are going to be part of that. Why? Because he told them that he would. He promised it in the Old Testament. He said, this is what I'm going to give you.
That's not spiritual promise. That
No.
can sit in their heart because we are now the temple of God.
No, that's for the church age. But the Old Testament prophecies are the lion and the lamb and the wolf will lie together. There'll be peace. There'll be, people have taken those promises and put them onto heaven, but they're talking about a kingdom where Jesus rules and reigns, where all of that goes. And if God did not fulfill those promises to Israel that he made for them throughout Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and all of the different prophetic words where he told them that there would be a time period where the Messiah would rule and reign, if he did not fulfill that, what does that say about the God that you serve? Of course he fulfills those promises.
Yes, I would have thought that would have been fulfilled on the cross.
The promises? No.
I'm thinking he, when he died, the curtain was ripped.
Yes.
So man is able to, go face to face with God. So
Absolutely.
And that the temple, we said we are the temple.
Absolutely.
So that's what he, could it not mean that he draws them, that they receive him?
Absolutely. And right now, that is how a Jew comes to God. Same way we do. And that ripping of the temple and all the things that you just said absolutely applies today. But when that ends, when the church age ends, and we're going to be told when the last Gentile is added to the church, whoever that is, whenever that happens, and God completes that, then the book of Revelation tells us about God dealing with the nation of Israel again in preparation for that kingdom that he has promised them, that messianic kingdom that he has promised them. And that is a physical promise. Remember that God's dealing with Israel is physical. It's a physical, you touch it. It's land, it's people, it's physical. God's dealing with the church is spiritual. It's a spiritual thing, different. All right, so let's go on to why do the majority of Jewish people choose not to believe in Jesus Christ? Why do they choose not to believe in Jesus Christ? Why did they then? Why do they now? It's really the same.
What they thought the Messiah was going to be, or who he was going to be.
Okay, so he wasn't who they thought because they thought the Messiah would. Okay, he would come. They're under oppression in Rome. They're paying 50% of their income in taxes. They're a mess. They're practically in slavery. They have some real issues. So what is the Messiah going to do? The Messiah is going to come and set up that kingdom we were just talking about, because that's promised in all those prophetic words. And so they know Torah. They know the Old Testament prophecy. And so if they're going to have that kingdom, then the Messiah has to come and be the king. And Jesus doesn't do that. Jesus doesn't come and do that yet. And so that's what they were expecting to come and happen to fulfill all of that prophetic word, is that the kingdom would be established at that time. Here's a weird thought. So if the Jewish nation and the leaders had accepted Jesus in that place, would the kingdom have been ushered in? It would have, but God already knew that wasn't the plan. because he already had in the Old Testament, he already had the teaching that there was going to be a different time when there was going to be a nation called to him. And so that wasn't part of the plan. But had the nation of Israel accepted Jesus individually and as a nation, would that messianic kingdom have been ushered in? Isn't that interesting to think about? But of course, God already knew how that was going to work out. Also, the other thing to remember is that for today, it's a big deal, and it was a big deal then too, is that when the Jewish leaders didn't believe, then the Jewish followers didn't believe. And so they put a great deal of trust into their leaders, that they would lead them, that they would shepherd them in the right way. And so when they didn't believe and the Jewish priesthood didn't follow Jesus, then that simply was an indication that they were not going to do it either. And today that's it. That's a stumbling block for Jewish people. All right, so here's a question. Why do a majority of Gentiles choose not to believe in Jesus Christ?
We want to be in charge.
Okay.
Egocentric.
Okay. Not enough proof. Disobedience. Why do the majority of Gentiles?
It's hard to submit to something you can't tangibly see.
Okay. Okay. Hard to submit to something that you can't touch. It's not part of your physical senses. Okay. How about we say also that it's the same reasons that the Jews didn't? And that is, he's not exactly what we thought he would be. Because if he was going to be what we thought he would be, we wouldn't have any issues. Our lives would be full of good things, not bad things. We wouldn't stumble and struggle and fall. If we're going to give our life to God, then surely everything's going to go great for us. Prosperity, good things only. You know, a good world where, why would we believe in a God where there's war? Why would we believe in a God where there's disease? Why would we, same things. He's not what we thought. Can you see? I'm trying to tie it in so that we recognize we're no different. Had we been in that first century, we're no different. We're not, you know, we would have looked and said, that's not what I'm looking for. That's not quite meeting up to my expectations. Also, many people don't believe because the people they respect don't believe. Maybe grandparents or parents or leaders or, you know, whatever. They see people in authority in other areas who maybe are not Christians, and they go, well, they're smarter than me. So if they don't believe, then why should I? Yes.
That's funny that you said that. My son just told me this weekend that somebody asked him why he believes in Christ, and he said the main reason is his, you know, he believes because he was convicted of his faith, that he believes in Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
But also, a main point was everyone he respects in life are Christians.
Okay. So that influence can go the other way, right? Good. So the people he respects are believers, and so it's easier for him to accept that because he respects those people. What if everyone he knew wasn't? How difficult is that? How difficult for the Jewish remnant now to leave their family and faith and believe in the Messiah, the Jewish Messiah. Very, very, you know, we need to remember, we tend to want to believe that the Jewish people were very ignorant of things, but guys, we're the same. We're exactly the same. All right. Who is the stumbling stone or the rock of offense, and why would he be called that? Jesus. All right. And so do you think of that ever, that Jesus is a stumbling stone or a rock of offense? Or does that offend you to think of it? He's not for us, but you got to put yourself outside of the little bubble that we live in. You know, he's not a stumbling block or a rock of offense for us, but he is a stumbling block or a rock of offense if you have worldly thoughts, if you think that you know, worldly success, if you think that the rules and limitations, the hypocrisy in the church, if you think of all of those things, or if you are the only one in your family who's a believer, that's a rock of offense. Because when everyone thinks you're crazy, you believe in a man who died on a cross, was buried, and you think he came back to life again. Can be a rock of offense, not only for the Jewish people, but for us today. Yes.
I'm thinking in the book of John, when the disciples were around them, and their comment was, I think you might have offended them. And it's like, that's who Jesus is, and that's what Jesus does. He speaks the truth out of our hearts.
Yes.
It's very difficult for us to do.
Yes.
We don't want to be judgmental, we don't want to be pharisaical, it's very.
That is exactly right. It is difficult for us to believe that to offend someone is a good thing, right? That's not an easy thing for us to do. You don't want them to be mad at you. You don't want them to think that you're a fanatic. You don't want them to have any issues with your relationship. And yet Jesus said, people are going to look at you and say, you are peculiar. You are a peculiar people. And yet we don't want that label.